Racist cop arrests black woman. Stunned when she is the judge presiding over his case. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, amber glow over the quiet suburban streets. Naomi Wright drove carefully, her hands steady on the wheel as she navigated her way home after a day of errands. As she approached a stop sign, she noticed a police cruiser parked at the corner. The sight was unremarkable at first, just another officer monitoring traffic. Naomi came to a complete stop, her turn signal clicking as she prepared to make her turn. But as she pulled into the intersection, the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights lit up her rear-view mirror. A sharp burst of a siren followed, signaling her to pull over. Naomi's stomach dropped. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Had she missed a stop sign? Was her tail light out? She glanced down at her speedometer. Everything seemed fine. She guided her car to the side of the road, turning off the engine and placing her hands visibly on the wheel, a habit ingrained in her long ago. The cruiser stopped behind her, its lights still flashing. Naomi watched in the mirror as the officer stepped out, his figure sharp and imposing in the bright sunlight. He adjusted his utility belt as he approached her car, one hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. Naomi rolled down her window, her heart pounding but her face calm. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice clipped and authoritative. Naomi nodded, keeping her movements deliberate as she reached into the glove compartment for her registration. "Of course, officer," she said, her tone measured. She handed him the documents along with a driver's license, her hands steady despite the anxiety creeping into her chest. The officer barely glanced at the paperwork before fixing her with a scrutinizing stare. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Naomi blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I was running errands," she replied carefully. "I'm heading home now." "Running errands," the officer repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. He leaned closer to the window, his eyes narrowing. "Do you live around here?" Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second. "No, I—" "Step out of the vehicle," he interrupted, his voice sharp and demanding. Naomi froze, her grip tightening on the wheel. "Officer, may I ask why you're stopping me?" she said, her voice calm but firm. The officer's expression hardened. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his hand moving slightly closer to his weapon. "Now." Realizing she had no choice, Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. She stepped out slowly, the cool air brushing against her skin. She stood beside her car, her posture straight but her nerves on edge. The officer motioned for her to move to the front of the vehicle. "Hands on the hood," he commanded. Naomi complied, placing her palms flat on the warm metal. The officer began a rough pat-down, his movements brisk and impersonal. A small crowd of bystanders started to gather on the sidewalk, their curious murmurs growing louder as they watched the scene unfold. A few raised their phones, recording the interaction. "What's in your car?" the officer asked, gesturing toward the passenger seat, where Naomi's bag rested. "Just my wallet, some receipts, and a book," she replied. Without asking for permission, the officer opened the car door and rifled through her bag. He pulled out the book, glanced at the cover, then tossed it back inside. "Suspicious behavior," he muttered, almost to himself. Naomi turned her head slightly, her voice steady but edged with frustration. "Officer, I don't understand. What have I done wrong?" The officer straightened, his hand moving to his cuffs. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said curtly. Naomi frowned. "What description? What does that even mean?" "Turn around," he ordered, ignoring her question. Before she could respond, the officer grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back. Naomi winced as the cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists, the sharp click echoing in the still air. "You're under arrest," the officer said flatly. Naomi's heart raced. "For what?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't answer. He guided her toward his patrol car, his grip firm on her arm. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and a few voices rose in protest. "Why are you arresting her?" a man called out. "She didn't do anything," another voice shouted. The officer ignored them. opening the door of his patrol car and helping Naomi inside. She sat stiffly, her mind racing as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Outside, the bystanders continued to record, their voices growing angrier as the cruiser pulled away. Naomi stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. Her thoughts were a chaotic swirl of confusion, fear, and anger. What had just happened? Why her? The answers felt distant, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. The ride to the precinct was suffocatingly quiet. Naomi sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs. The faint hum of the car's engine was the only sound, punctuated occasionally by the crackle of the officer's radio. She tried to calm her breathing, but the questions in her mind were relentless. What had just happened? Why was she being treated like a criminal? Through the window, the streets blurred into an indistinct wash of colors. She caught glimpses of bystanders, some turning to look at the flashing lights of the cruiser, others oblivious to its passing. Naomi's reflection stared back at her from the glass, her eyes wide and filled with disbelief. The car finally slowed as it approached the precinct. The towering brick building loomed ahead, its stark, utilitarian design reflecting the coldness of the moment. The officer parked near the entrance and stepped out, opening the back door without a word. Naomi hesitated for a moment before sliding out, the cuffs digging into her skin as she moved. The officer's grip on her arm was firm but not rough as he guided her toward the building. Naomi kept her head high, refusing to let the humiliation sink her shoulders. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting an unflattering glow over the tiled floors and beige walls. The air was sterile, tinged with the faint smell of disinfectant. As they entered, a few officers glanced up from their desks. Some looked away almost immediately, returning to their paperwork or conversations. Others allowed their gazes to linger, their expressions a mix of curiosity and indifference. It was as though Naomi wasn't a person but a problem, something to be processed and moved along. "Booking," the arresting officer said curtly to a clerk sitting behind a high counter. The clerk, a tired-looking man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, barely glanced at Naomi before sliding a clipboard toward the officer. The sound of pen scratching paper filled the silence as the officer began filling out forms, his demeanor one of routine efficiency. Naomi stood quietly, her heart pounding. She wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but she could feel the weight of the stares around her. Any protest, she knew, might only escalate the situation further. Once the paperwork was completed, the officer led Naomi to a small room off the main hall. The space was cramped and impersonal, dominated by a desk, a chair, and a fingerprinting station. The officer removed her cuffs, the sudden freedom a small but fleeting relief. He motioned for her to sit. "Left hand," he said brusquely. Naomi complied, pressing her fingers onto the ink pad and then the fingerprint card. The process was mechanical, devoid of any acknowledgement of her humanity. When it was over, the officer handed her a wet wipe and turned away, organizing the forms he had just completed. "Do I get to know what I'm being charged with?" Naomi finally asked, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. The officer glanced at her briefly, his face unreadable. "You'll know soon enough," he said before leaving the room. Naomi was escorted to a holding cell, a stark, bare room with metal benches and a narrow window near the ceiling. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound reverberating in the small space. She sat on one of the benches, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her thoughts racing. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Naomi glanced at the window, where a faint strip of sunlight struggled to seep through. The muffled sounds of activity echoed from the hallway beyond the cell, indistinct voices and the occasional clatter of equipment reminding her that life outside this room continued, oblivious to her situation. Meanwhile, in the main precinct, the officer who had arrested Naomi spoke briefly with a few colleagues. His tone was casual, his recounting of the arrest lacking any sense of urgency or reflection. "Another one for the books," he said, leaning against a desk. One of the other officers raised an eyebrow. What did she do? The arresting officer shrugged, looked suspicious, circling the neighborhood, acting nervous. Fit the description of someone we were looking for. "She give you any trouble?" another asked, his voice laced with indifference. "Nothing I couldn't handle," the officer replied, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The conversation was brief, the group quickly moving on to other topics. To them, Naomi's arrest was just another part of the day, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of their duties. Back in the holding cell, Naomi's initial shock began to give way to a simmering anger. She replayed the arrest in her mind, every word, every action etched into her memory. The humiliation, the unjustness of it all, burned in her chest. But even as the frustration threatened to consume her, she took a deep breath and reminded herself to stay calm. She didn't know how or when, but she was determined that this wouldn't end here. Whatever this was, whatever they thought they could do to her, she would find a way to fight back. The sound of keys jingling outside the cell door pulled Naomi from her thoughts. The door opened, and an officer gestured for her to follow. She stood, her step steady as she left the holding cell behind. The sun had long since set, and the air inside the precinct felt heavier than before. Naomi didn't know what awaited her, but she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The video began as just another upload to social media. A shaky, handheld recording of a police officer arresting a woman in the middle of a quiet neighborhood. The caption read, "This is what racial profiling looks like." Within hours, the post started to gain traction, shared and reposted by thousands. By morning, it had gone viral. The footage captured everything: Naomi's calm demeanor, her compliance with the officer's demands, and the unnecessary escalation that followed. Her voice was clear in the video as she asked for an explanation, her tone measured but firm. The officer's abrupt commands and dismissive replies painted a stark picture, one that was impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, hashtags like #JusticeForNaomi and #EndRacial Profiling were trending across multiple platforms. In Naomi's neighborhood, the story quickly became the topic of conversation. At local coffee shops and grocery stores, people shared the video, their voices tinged with disbelief and anger. "I've seen her around," one neighbor said, shaking her head as she scrolled through the comment section. "She's the nicest person. How could this happen to her?" At a nearby church, community leaders gathered to discuss the growing outrage. Reverend Daniel Price, a well-known activist, spoke to a group of congregants after the evening service. "This isn't just about Naomi," he said, holding up his phone with the video paused on the screen. "This is about a system that continues to target people of color, to humiliate and dehumanize them. We can't let this pass quietly." For Naomi, the next morning felt surreal. She sat at her kitchen table, her phone buzzing constantly with notifications. Friends, family, and even strangers had reached out to offer their support. Some messages were heartfelt and encouraging, while others were angry on her behalf, calling for immediate action. Denise, a close friend, arrived mid-morning with coffee and a determined expression. She placed the cups on the table and pulled out her laptop. "Naomi, have you seen this?" Denise asked, spinning the screen to show her the video. Naomi's breath caught as she watched the footage. Seeing herself on the screen brought the humiliation flooding back, but it also sparked something else, a quiet resolve. "I didn't realize someone was recording," Naomi said softly, her eyes glued to the screen. "Everyone's talking about it," Denise said, her voice firm. "And they should be. What he did to you wasn't just wrong. It was disgusting. You need to fight this." Naomi hesitated. "I don't even know where to start." "I do," Denise said with a small smile. "I've already reached out to a lawyer. His name is Marcus Green. He specializes in cases like this." Meanwhile, at the police precinct, Officer Mark Peterson sat in the break room, scrolling through his own social media feed. He chuckled to himself as he read some of the angry comments under the video. "They don't know anything," he muttered, shaking his head. A fellow officer leaned over. "You okay, Peterson? Looks like people are pretty worked up about that video." "It's nothing," Peterson replied, waving a hand dismissively. "This kind of thing blows over in a week. People get mad online and then they move on. It's just noise." But even as he spoke, there was a nagging unease in his gut. He had dealt with complaints before, but something about this felt different. The attention, the speed at which the story was spreading, it was growing out of his control. That afternoon, Naomi met Marcus Green for the first time in his small but well-kept office. He greeted her with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I've reviewed the video," Marcus began, pulling a notepad from his desk. "What happened to you was a blatant abuse of power. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you get justice." Naomi shifted in her seat, her nerves evident. "I've never been in a situation like this before. What does that even look like?" "Justice." Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. "It looks like accountability. It looks like making sure people like Officer Peterson can't keep getting away with this. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take courage. Are you ready for that?" Naomi nodded, the fire in her eyes growing. "I'm ready." As Naomi left Marcus's office, the weight of the situation settled over her. But with it came a sense of purpose. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, a fleeting moment of beauty amid the storm she was about to face. Meanwhile, in the precinct, Peterson sat at his desk, unaware that his actions had set something much larger in motion. What he dismissed as a fleeting controversy was quickly becoming a wave he couldn't outrun. The courthouse was bustling with activity as Naomi walked through its imposing doors. Her steps were steady, her chin held high, but inside, a storm of nerves churned. Beside her, Marcus Green carried a briefcase, his expression calm and resolute. The whispers of onlookers followed them, some recognizing Naomi from the viral video, others simply curious about the case that had captured so much attention. The courtroom itself was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Its wooden benches and high ceilings carried an air of solemnity. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table, taking a deep breath as she scanned the room. It was surreal to be here, to know her story had brought her to this moment. Across the room, the defense team settled into their seats. Among them was Officer Mark Peterson, his confident smirk firmly in place. He leaned back slightly in his chair, whispering something to his lawyer, David Crane, who responded with a curt nod. Peterson appeared unfazed, as though this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The chatter in the courtroom died down as the bailiff entered, his voice booming. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Presiding." Everyone stood as the doors behind the bench opened. The judge entered, her robes flowing as she ascended to her seat. Peterson's smirk vanished in an instant, his face draining of color. It was her, the woman he had arrested. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as his mind raced. Naomi didn't look at Peterson, her focus locked on Judge Cassandra Wright. The judge took her seat, adjusting her papers as she surveyed the room. Her expression was composed, her authority radiating in the way she held herself. "You may be seated," she said, her voice steady and firm. The room obeyed, the creak of wooden benches breaking the silence. Peterson's lawyer glanced at him, confused by his sudden change in demeanor. "Mark, what's wrong?" Crane whispered. Peterson didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the judge. Judge Wright addressed the room, her tone commanding but impartial. "This court is now in session. We are here to review the civil case brought forth by Ms. Naomi Wright against Officer Mark Peterson. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" "The plaintiff is ready, Your Honor," Marcus Green said, rising from his seat. "The defense is ready," Crane replied, though his voice carried an undertone of uncertainty. Judge Wright nodded. "Very well. Mr. Green, you may begin." Marcus stood and walked to the center of the courtroom, his movements deliberate. He began with a brief but powerful opening statement, laying the groundwork for Naomi's case. He spoke of accountability, of the abuse of power, and of the systemic issues that allowed situations like this to persist. Crane followed, his tone defensive as he painted Peterson as a seasoned officer who had acted within the bounds of his training. He emphasized the high-pressure nature of law enforcement and the need for split-second decisions. Throughout both statements, Judge Wright remained impassive, her gaze steady as she listened. As the proceedings unfolded, Peterson grew increasingly uncomfortable. He couldn't shake the feeling of Judge Wright's presence. Every time her gavel struck or her voice broke the tension, it sent a chill down his spine. He leaned toward Crane during a recess. "Why didn't anyone tell me she was the judge?" he hissed. Crane frowned, his confusion evident. "Who?" Peterson gestured subtly toward the bench. "Her. She's the one I arrested." Crane's face darkened, and he glanced at the judge. He quickly pulled Peterson aside, lowering his voice. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" "I didn't know," Peterson muttered, his voice defensive. "It was just another arrest. How was I supposed to know she'd end up here?" Crane exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You've put us in a corner. Keep your mouth shut and let me handle this." Naomi sat silently at her table, her resolve unwavering. The weight of Peterson's gaze didn't faze her. She knew he was rattled, and that knowledge gave her strength. When the court reconvened after the recess, Marcus began calling witnesses. He started with Denise, the woman who had recorded the arrest. Her testimony was clear and detailed, painting a vivid picture of the events that had unfolded. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the video was played for the court. The room was silent, save for the sounds of the recording, Naomi's calm voice, Peterson's sharp commands, and the murmurs of the growing crowd. At one point during the proceedings, Crane attempted to object to a line of questioning. His tone grew argumentative, his frustration with the mounting evidence evident. "Mr. Crane," Judge Wright said sharply, cutting through his words, "this is a court of law, not a platform for grandstanding. I will not tolerate unnecessary interruptions. Proceed within the bounds of the law, or your objection will be overruled." Her authority was absolute, and Crane immediately fell silent. Peterson glanced at the judge, her composure only deepening his unease. As the day drew to a close, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Naomi's story was unfolding piece by piece, and the cracks in Peterson's defense were beginning to show. Outside, the protests grew louder, their chants echoing through the courthouse walls. Peterson left the courtroom with his head low, the weight of Judge Wright's presence bearing down on him. Naomi, on the other hand, walked out with quiet determination. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. The courtroom was silent as Judge Cassandra Wright took her seat on the bench. The day's proceedings had been intense, with mounting evidence painting a grim picture of Officer Mark Peterson's actions. Yet, it was her presence that commanded the room, a quiet, unyielding authority that left no room for doubt about who was in charge. Naomi Carter sat at her table, her gaze steady and focused. Marcus Green was beside her, his papers meticulously organized. Across the room, Peterson sat rigidly, his confidence shaken after the events of the previous day. His lawyer, David Crane, whispered instructions to him, but Peterson barely nodded, his attention fixed on the judge. The gavel struck, its sharp sound breaking the stillness. "Court is now in session," Judge Wright announced. "We will continue with the plaintiff's case. Mr. Green, you may proceed." Marcus rose, his steps deliberate as he approached the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I would like to call Officer Peterson to the stand for cross-examination." The gallery murmured softly, the tension in the room palpable. Peterson glanced at Crane, who gave him a reassuring nod before motioning for him to stand. The officer adjusted his tie as he made his way to the stand, his movements stiff and deliberate. Peterson took the oath, his voice steady, though his hands betrayed a faint tremor. He sat down, his posture rigid, as Marcus approached with a calm but commanding presence. "Officer Peterson," Marcus began, his tone measured, "you've testified that you believed Miss Carter's behavior was suspicious. Can you explain what, specifically, led you to that conclusion?" Peterson cleared his throat. "She was driving slowly through the neighborhood, circling a block multiple times. In my experience, that kind of behavior often indicates someone scouting for illegal activity." "And did you observe any illegal activity?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp but not confrontational. "No, but," Peterson began. "Just to clarify," Marcus interjected, "you made the decision to arrest Ms. Carter without any evidence of a crime. Is that correct?" Peterson's jaw tightened. I acted on my training and instincts." As Marcus continued to press Peterson, Crane stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness." Judge Wright fixed Crane with a pointed stare. "Overruled. The line of questioning is relevant to the case. Mr. Green, proceed." Marcus nodded, returning his attention to Peterson. "Officer, is it standard procedure to arrest someone based solely on your instincts?" Peterson hesitated, his confidence visibly faltering. "It's part of assessing potential threats," he said finally. "So you would consider Ms. Carter a threat?" Marcus asked, his voice rising slightly. "She fit the description," Peterson began, but Judge Wright's sharp voice cut through his words. "Officer Peterson," she said, her tone cold but controlled, "this court requires direct answers. Please refrain from deflecting the questions." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Peterson glanced at the judge, his discomfort evident, before muttering, "No, I wouldn't consider her a threat." After Peterson's cross-examination concluded, Judge Wright addressed the courtroom. Her gaze swept over the room, pausing briefly on Peterson before moving to Crane. "This case has highlighted several troubling issues regarding the conduct of law enforcement," she began. "As a judge, it is my duty to ensure that justice is served fairly and impartially. However, let me make one thing clear. This court will not tolerate any attempts to minimize the gravity of what occurred." Her words were deliberate, her tone unwavering. "Officer Peterson, your actions during Ms. Carter's arrest are under scrutiny not just in this courtroom but in the court of public opinion. It is your responsibility to answer for them honestly and completely." The gallery murmured softly, the weight of her words settling over the room. Peterson sat stiffly, his face pale. Crane leaned over and whispered something to him, but Peterson didn't respond. Naomi sat silently at her table, her hands resting in her lap. Judge Wright's words had resonated deeply with her. She felt seen, heard, and validated in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time, it felt as though the system might work in her favor. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "We're making progress. Just stay strong." Naomi nodded, her resolve growing stronger with each passing moment. As the court adjourned for the day, the tension in the room lingered. Peterson left the courtroom quickly, his steps hurried as though he couldn't escape fast enough. Outside, the protests had grown larger, their chants echoing through the streets. Naomi walked out with Marcus, her head held high. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like she had the upper hand. Judge Wright's warning had set the tone for what was to come, and Naomi was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The courtroom was packed as the trial continued into its most pivotal phase, the presentation of evidence. The atmosphere was tense, each moment heavy with anticipation. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture calm but her eyes sharp, watching every move. Across the room, Officer Mark Peterson shifted uneasily, his confidence visibly eroded by the events of the previous days. His lawyer, David Crane, whispered quietly to him, their conversation barely audible above the hum of the courtroom. Judge Cassandra Wright took her seat, her presence immediately silencing the room. "Court is now in session," she announced, her voice firm. "Mr. Green, you may proceed with your case." Marcus Green rose from his chair, his expression composed but resolute. He carried a folder of documents to the center of the courtroom, setting it down on the evidence table with deliberate care. "Your Honor," Marcus began, addressing the judge, "the plaintiff would like to submit Exhibit A, video footage of the arrest in question. This video, recorded by a bystander, provides an unfiltered account of the events leading up to and during Ms. Carter's arrest." The defense immediately objected. Crane stood, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, we contest the use of this video. Its context is incomplete, and its release to the public has already biased these proceedings." Judge Wright raised a hand to silence him. "Mr. Crane, the court will consider the context of all evidence presented. Unless you have grounds to prove this video is inadmissible, the objection is overruled." Crane hesitated, then reluctantly sat down. Judge Wright nodded toward Marcus. "Proceed." The lights dimmed slightly as the video was played for the court. The room fell silent, save for the faint rustling of clothing as the audience leaned forward in their seats. The shaky footage showed Naomi standing beside her car, her movements calm but deliberate. Peterson's voice was clear in the recording, his tone sharp and commanding as he barked orders. The murmurs began when the video showed Peterson handcuffing Naomi without providing any clear explanation. Her repeated question, "What have I done wrong?" went unanswered. The crowd in the courtroom stirred as the video continued, capturing the tense interaction in its entirety. Once the video concluded, Marcus called his first witness to the stand, Denise Harris, the bystander who had recorded the footage. Denise was sworn in, her expression serious but composed as she took her seat. "Ms. Harris," Marcus began, "you were present at the scene of Ms. Carter's arrest. Can you describe what you observed?" Denise nodded. "I was walking my dog when I saw the officer pull her over. At first, it seemed like a routine stop, but then things escalated. The officer seemed angry, even though Ms. Carter was calm and cooperative." "What prompted you to start recording?" Marcus asked. When he told her to step out of the car without explaining why, Denise replied, "I've seen too many stories like this. I wanted to make sure there was a record of what happened." Marcus gestured toward the screen where the video had just played. "Is this the video you recorded?" "Yes, it is," Denise confirmed. Crane rose for cross-examination, his tone sharp. "Ms. Harris, you claim you started recording because you felt the situation was escalating. Isn't it possible you misunderstood what was happening?" Denise met his gaze evenly. "I don't think I misunderstood someone being arrested without a clear reason." "And yet, you don't have the full context," Crane pressed. "You didn't hear the initial conversation between the officer and Ms. Carter, did you?" "No," Denise admitted, "but I didn't need to. The video speaks for itself." Marcus wasn't finished. He presented another piece of evidence, the dashboard camera footage from Peterson's patrol car. The video was played next, showing a wider angle of the arrest. It corroborated Denise's recording, further emphasizing Naomi's compliance and Peterson's unnecessary escalation. As the second video ended, Marcus turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've now seen two perspectives of the same incident. Both show the same thing, a woman treated as a criminal without cause. This is not law enforcement, it's abuse of power." Crane attempted to counter the growing momentum. He questioned the validity of the recordings, suggesting they didn't capture the full context. He argued that Peterson had acted on reasonable suspicion, relying on his years of training and experience. But the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The jury's expressions were a mix of disbelief and discomfort as they processed what they had seen. As the session continued, Peterson's discomfort grew. He fidgeted in his seat, his gaze darting between the jury and the judge. Every piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin of his defense. He whispered to Crane during a recess, his voice low but strained. "They're twisting everything. They're presenting facts, Mark," Crane replied bluntly. "You need to stay composed." Peterson's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The day ended with a heavy silence hanging over the courtroom. The evidence presented had been damning, and it was clear the tide was turning. Naomi left the courthouse with Marcus, her heart heavy but her resolve stronger than ever. Outside, the protests continued, their voices growing louder as the community rallied behind her. Inside, Peterson remained at the defense table, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the case against him. For the first time, he began to realize that this might not end the way he had expected. The courthouse steps were a sea of signs, banners, and voices. Protesters had gathered in larger numbers than ever before, their chants echoing through the streets. Justice for Naomi. No more abuse of power. End racial profiling now. The energy was electric, a powerful combination of frustration and hope. Families, students, activists, and community leaders stood shoulder to shoulder, their presence a visible reminder of the trial's significance. Naomi Wright stood behind a window on the second floor of the courthouse, looking down at the crowd. The sight was overwhelming, yet deeply moving. She had never imagined her story would spark something this big. Marcus Green stood beside her, his arms crossed as he observed the scene. "They're here for you," Marcus said softly. Naomi shook her head. They're here for all of us. This isn't just about me anymore. Marcus nodded. And that's why we have to keep going. Outside, Reverend Daniel Price took the microphone at the center of the crowd. His booming voice carried over the chants, his words inspiring and galvanizing. Today, we stand not just for Naomi Wright, but for every black man and woman who has been profiled, targeted, and dehumanized by a broken system, he declared, raising his fist. We are here to demand accountability, not just in this courtroom, but across the nation. No more excuses, no more silence. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Nearby, local activists handed out flyers urging attendees to register to vote, to attend community meetings, and to push for reforms in local law enforcement policies. This trial is a spark, one activist said as she passed a flyer to a young woman. But real change happens when we hold the system accountable at every level. Reporters lined the perimeter of the courthouse, their cameras capturing the protests and broadcasting them live to audiences across the country. Inside the courtroom, media coverage was restricted, but outside, the story had taken on a life of its own. This case has become a flashpoint in the national conversation about racial injustice and police accountability, one reporter said into her microphone. The footage of Naomi Wright's arrest has drawn widespread outrage, with many calling it a clear example of racial profiling and abuse of power. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #JusticeForNaomi, #EndRacialProfiling, and #HoldCopsAccountable. High-profile figures, including celebrities and politicians, had weighed in, adding their voices to the growing outcry. The protests outside were impossible to ignore, even within the courtroom's walls. The muffled sound of chanting filtered in, a constant reminder of the trial's importance. The jury exchanged glances, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Judge Cassandra Wright addressed the court, her voice firm. I will remind everyone that this courtroom is a place of law, not spectacle. The proceedings will continue based on the evidence and arguments presented here, not on public opinion. Her words restored a sense of order, but the tension in the room remained thick. At the defense table, Officer Mark Peterson sat rigidly, his jaw tight as he listened to the faint echoes of the crowd outside. His hands were clasped together on the table, his knuckles white from the pressure. They're making this into something it's not, he muttered to his lawyer, David Crane. Crane adjusted his tie, his expression carefully neutral. This isn't just about you anymore, Mark. It's bigger than that. You need to stay focused and let me handle the legal side. Focused? Peterson hissed. They're out there treating me like a criminal. Crane leaned closer, his voice low but sharp. If you lose your temper in here, you'll prove them right. So keep it together. Peterson fell silent, his frustration simmering just below the surface. During a lunch recess, Naomi stepped outside to address the crowd. The protesters quieted as she approached the microphone, their attention fixed on her. Marcus stood nearby, giving her an encouraging nod. Naomi took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began. Thank you, she said, her words carrying over the crowd. Thank you for standing with me, for standing with all of us. This isn't just about me. It's about fighting for a system that values every life equally, that treats everyone with dignity and respect. The crowd erupted into applause, their chants of support growing louder. Naomi's words were simple but powerful, resonating deeply with those who had come to support her. As the day's proceedings resumed, the energy from the protests outside seemed to seep into the courtroom. The jurors appeared more attentive, the weight of their responsibility evident in their expressions. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table, her resolve strengthened by the voices of the community behind her. For Peterson, the protests were a constant reminder of the growing scrutiny he faced. His arrogance was cracking under the weight of public pressure and the relentless march of the trial. The fight for justice was far from over, but the tide was turning, and Naomi's voice was leading the charge. The courtroom was abuzz with quiet murmurs as Officer Mark Peterson was called to the stand. His lawyer, David Crane, patted him on the shoulder as he stood, whispering, "Stay composed. Don't let them rattle you." Peterson nodded, though his expression betrayed the simmering frustration that had been building throughout the trial. He adjusted his tie and strode to the witness stand, his posture stiff with tension. The eyes of the jury bore into him, their expressions unreadable. Naomi Carter sat at her table, her gaze steady but unwavering, a silent reminder of why they were all there. Once sworn in, Peterson sat down and folded his hands, trying to project an air of calm professionalism. Marcus Green stood at the plaintiff's table, watching him intently, his questions carefully prepared. Crane approached the stand, his tone measured. "Officer Peterson, can you walk us through the events of the day you stopped Ms. Carter?" Peterson straightened, his voice even but firm. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I noticed a vehicle driving slowly and circling the block. This type of behavior is consistent with individuals scouting for criminal activity. What happened next?" Crane asked. "I initiated a traffic stop to investigate further," Peterson replied. "When I approached the vehicle, I asked the driver, Ms. Carter, for her license and registration, which she provided. However, her demeanor seemed nervous, and her movements were deliberate, which raised additional suspicion." Crane nodded. "And what led to her arrest?" Peterson hesitated, his voice tightening slightly. "She refused to answer some of my questions about why she was in the area. Given the circumstances, I believed it was necessary to detain her for further questioning." Marcus rose slowly, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Peterson's growing defensiveness. He approached the stand, his steps deliberate. "Officer Peterson," Marcus began, "you've testified that Ms. Carter's behavior was suspicious. Can you clarify what specifically about her actions led you to that conclusion?" Peterson's jaw tightened. "She was driving in a way that matched the profile of someone scouting the area for criminal purposes." "So," Marcus said, raising an eyebrow, "driving slowly in a residential neighborhood is enough to warrant suspicion?" "It wasn't just that," Peterson said quickly. "It was her demeanor, her refusal to answer questions." "Refusal?" Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "Didn't the video show Ms. Carter complying with your requests for her license and registration?" Peterson hesitated. "Yes, but—" "And didn't the video also show her asking repeatedly why she was being stopped, without receiving a clear answer from you?" "She was being evasive," Peterson snapped, his frustration slipping through. "Evasive?" Marcus echoed, his tone rising slightly. "Or was she simply asking for an explanation? A basic right of any citizen being detained by law enforcement?" David Crane stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness." Judge Wright's gaze fixed on Peterson, then shifted to Crane. "Overruled. Mr. Green, proceed." Marcus nodded, stepping closer to the witness stand. "Officer Peterson, in your professional opinion, do you believe Ms. Carter posed an immediate threat to anyone's safety?" Peterson hesitated, his shoulders stiffening. "At the time, I believe she might." "And yet," Marcus pressed, "you found no evidence of illegal activity, correct?" Peterson's lips thinned. "Correct." As the questioning continued, Peterson's frustration began to boil over. His answers grew shorter, his tone defensive. Marcus's calm persistence chipped away at his composure, exposing the arrogance that had driven his actions. "Officer Peterson," Marcus said, his voice steady, "do you believe your badge gives you the authority to act on instinct alone, without evidence or justification?" "I acted within my training," Peterson shot back, his voice rising. "I've been an officer for years. I know what suspicious behavior looks like." "Suspicious behavior," Marcus repeated. "Or behavior that didn't fit your assumptions of who belongs in that neighborhood?" The courtroom was silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavily in the air. Peterson's face reddened, but he said nothing. Judge Wright leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "Officer Peterson, this court expects clear and respectful responses. Please remember where you are and the gravity of these proceedings." Peterson swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor." As the day's session concluded, Peterson left the stand, his confidence visibly shaken. The jury watched him closely, their expressions betraying a mix of skepticism and discomfort. Naomi remained seated, her calm demeanor unchanged, though a flicker of satisfaction crossed her face. Outside the courthouse, the protests continued to swell, their chants echoing louder than ever. Inside, The trial had reached a critical turning point. Peterson's arrogance, once his shield, was now his greatest vulnerability, and the tide was shifting irrevocably against him. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere taut with anticipation. The tension that had been simmering throughout the trial was now at its peak. All eyes were on Judge Cassandra Wright as she took her seat on the bench, her expression unreadable but commanding. The case had reached a critical juncture, and the weight of the proceedings was palpable. Naomi Wright sat at the plaintiff's table, her gaze steady. Marcus Green was beside her, his demeanor calm yet focused. Across the room, Officer Mark Peterson sat rigidly, his hands clasped tightly on the table. His lawyer, David Crane, whispered to him in low, urgent tones. But Peterson barely responded, his mind clearly elsewhere. The session began with a sense of finality, as if everyone present could feel that something pivotal was about to unfold. Marcus Green stood, a folder of documents in hand. He approached the center of the courtroom with deliberate steps, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "over the past several days, you've heard testimony, seen video footage, and reviewed evidence that paints a clear picture of what happened during Ms. Carter's arrest. Today, I will present one final piece of evidence. Records that reveal a troubling pattern in Officer Peterson's past behavior." The gallery stirred, whispers rippling through the room. Peterson's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. Crane shot Marcus a sharp look, but Judge Wright's firm voice silenced any objections before they could be raised. "Proceed, Mr. Green," she said. Marcus approached the evidence table and held up a stack of papers. "These are formal complaints filed against Officer Peterson over the past 5 years. Complaints from citizens who describe experiences strikingly similar to Ms. Carter's: detentions without cause, disrespectful treatment, and racially charged language." He handed copies to the jury and the judge, his movements slow and deliberate, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "In each of these cases," Marcus continued, "the complaints were dismissed without thorough investigation. These records demonstrate a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored." Crane stood quickly, his voice tight. "Your Honor, we object to the inclusion of these records. They are irrelevant to the specific incident being tried today." Judge Wright raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Crane, these records speak directly to the character and conduct of the defendant. The objection is overruled." Crane sat down, visibly frustrated, while Peterson's discomfort grew. He leaned toward Crane, whispering, "Why didn't you stop this?" "I tried," Crane snapped quietly, "but you didn't exactly give me much to work with." The jury reviewed the documents, their expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval. The pattern Marcus had described was clear, and it was damning. Judge Wright turned her gaze to Peterson, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Peterson, the evidence presented in this court suggests a troubling disregard for the principles of justice and equality that law enforcement is meant to uphold. This is not a judgment, but it is a call for reflection on your actions, your decisions, and the impact they have on the lives of others." Her words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Peterson avoided her gaze, his confidence now reduced to a fragile facade. Naomi sat silently, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't smile or react outwardly, but inside, she felt a small flicker of vindication. For the first time, it seemed as though the truth was cutting through the noise, and the accountability she had sought was within reach. The jury's faces were a study in concentration as they absorbed the evidence. The gallery was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Outside, the distant sound of protests echoed faintly through the walls, a reminder of the broader significance of the trial. Marcus returned to the plaintiff's table, his job for the day done. He leaned toward Naomi and whispered, "We're turning the tide. Stay strong." She nodded, her resolve unwavering. As the court adjourned for the day, Peterson lingered in his seat, his head bowed. The once confident officer now appeared small, his arrogance replaced by unease. Crane stood beside him, gathering their documents. "Mark," Crane said quietly, "we need to talk strategy. This isn't looking good." Peterson didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the table. For the first time, the reality of his situation was sinking in. The courthouse emptied slowly, the weight of the day's revelations lingering in the air. Naomi walked out into the cool evening, the chants of protesters growing louder as they saw her. She raised a hand in acknowledgement, their support fueling her determination. Inside, Peterson sat alone in the defense's preparation room, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of regret, anger, and fear. The walls seemed to close in around him, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of accountability bearing down. The turning point had arrived, and there was no going back. The courtroom was unusually quiet as the day began. The tension that had been building throughout the trial was now razor-sharp, with everyone present aware that the case had reached a critical moment. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table, her expression calm but focused, while Marcus Green prepared to unveil the next layer of evidence. Across the room, Officer Mark Peterson looked visibly tense. His lawyer, David Crane, leaned in to speak to him, his voice low but urgent. Peterson nodded stiffly, his gaze darting toward the judge's bench, where Cassandra Wright sat, reviewing her notes. Her composure was unshaken, her authority palpable. When the gavel struck, the room fell silent. "Court is now in session," Judge Wright announced. "Mr. Green, you may proceed." Marcus stood and addressed the court with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, today I will present evidence that speaks directly to Officer Peterson's professional conduct. This includes his personnel records and formal complaints filed against him during his tenure as a law enforcement officer." David Crane immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. These records are prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific incident involving Ms. Carter." Judge Wright didn't hesitate. Overruled. "The court will consider the relevance of this evidence in its entirety. Proceed, Mr. Green." Marcus nodded, approaching the jury with a stack of documents. "These are official records obtained from the precinct where Officer Peterson has worked for the past 10 years. They include multiple complaints of misconduct, ranging from excessive use of force to racially charged language." The gallery murmured softly, the weight of Marcus's words rippling through the room. Peterson shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. Marcus handed copies of the records to the jury and the judge, his voice steady as he continued. "Over the past decade, Officer Peterson has been the subject of 12 formal complaints. In each instance, the complaints were dismissed without thorough investigation. However, the patterns within these complaints cannot be ignored." He walked to the evidence table and displayed a summary chart on the courtroom screen. The chart listed the complaints chronologically, with brief descriptions of each incident. "For example," Marcus said, pointing to one entry, "in 2018, a man reported being stopped and detained by Officer Peterson without cause. The report describes language and actions eerily similar to those seen in Ms. Carter's arrest." He moved to another entry. "In 2020, a woman filed a complaint after being pulled over for what Peterson described as suspicious behavior. The case was dismissed despite eyewitness accounts corroborating her claims of mistreatment." As Marcus spoke, the jury's expressions ranged from shock to quiet anger. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Crane called Peterson to the stand in an attempt to counter the damaging testimony. Peterson adjusted his tie and took his seat, his expression carefully composed but his hands visibly trembling. "Officer Peterson," Crane began, his tone measured, "can you explain the context behind these complaints? Were they investigated thoroughly?" Peterson cleared his throat. "Many of the complaints were baseless. In law enforcement, you deal with difficult situations, and sometimes people file complaints out of frustration or misunderstanding. So you believe these complaints were not reflective of your actions or intent?" Crane pressed. "That's correct," Peterson said, his confidence growing slightly. "I've always acted within the bounds of my training in the law." When Marcus rose for cross-examination, the room fell silent. His steps were deliberate, his voice calm but pointed. "Officer Peterson," Marcus began, "you stated that the complaints against you were baseless. Is that correct?" "Yes," Peterson replied. "And yet," Marcus continued, "in nearly every case, the complainants described similar behavior. Detaining individuals without clear cause, using dismissive or condescending language, and escalating situations unnecessarily. Are you suggesting that all these individuals were mistaken?" Peterson hesitated. "I'm saying that in my line of work, decisions have to be made quickly. Sometimes those decisions are misunderstood. Misunderstood, Marcus repeated. But doesn't a pattern of similar complaints suggest something more than mere misunderstandings? Doesn't it suggest a consistent behavior on your part? Peterson's jaw tightened. I disagree with that characterization. Marcus stepped closer, his voice rising slightly. Officer Peterson, do you believe you've ever let your personal biases influence your actions in the field? Peterson's face reddened. No, I have not. As the exchange grew more intense, Judge Wright intervened. Mr. Green, focus your questions. Officer Peterson, answer them directly and succinctly. The courtroom settled. The tension momentarily diffused. Marcus took a step back, his expression calm but determined. No further questions, Your Honor, he said, returning to his seat. As the court adjourned for the day, the weight of the evidence lingered heavily in the room. Peterson left the stand with his confidence visibly shaken. His steps hurried as he returned to the defense table. Crane leaned in to speak to him, but Peterson barely acknowledged him, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Naomi watched quietly from her seat, her resolve stronger than ever. The truth was coming to light, and the once unshakable facade of Officer Peterson was beginning to crumble. Outside, the protests grew louder, their chants echoing through the courthouse walls. The fight for justice was far from over, but the tide was undeniably turning. The courtroom brimmed with a charged silence as both legal teams prepared for what promised to be the most heated exchange of the trial. The stakes had never been higher. Naomi Wright sat at her table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze unwavering. Across the room, Officer Mark Peterson looked tense, his once confident demeanor cracking under the weight of the mounting evidence against him. Judge Cassandra Wright, seated at the bench, glanced between the two sides before striking her gavel. Court is now in session. Mr. Crane, you may proceed with your defense. David Crane stood and approached the jury, his expression one of calm authority. He spoke slowly, his voice measured as he laid out his argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is a misunderstanding. Officer Peterson is a man who has dedicated his career to protecting his community. In his line of work, split-second decisions are a necessity, and sometimes, those decisions are misinterpreted. He paced slowly, meeting the eyes of each juror. We ask that you consider the full context of his actions. Officer Peterson acted in good faith, based on his training and the information available to him at the time. Yes, mistakes may have been made, but mistakes do not equal malice. Crane then turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request that the court recognize the immense pressure placed on law enforcement officers and the difficulty of their role in ensuring public safety. Marcus Green rose as Crane returned to his seat. His steps were deliberate as he approached the jury, his voice calm but filled with conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, what you've just heard is an attempt to excuse a pattern of behavior that cannot and should not be ignored. This is not about a single mistake or an isolated incident. This is about accountability, about ensuring that those who are entrusted with the power to protect and serve do so with integrity, not prejudice. He gestured toward Naomi. Ms. Carter was humiliated, detained, and treated as less than human without cause. This wasn't a split-second decision. It was a deliberate act rooted in bias, as evidenced by the video, the testimony, and the history of complaints against Officer Peterson. Marcus's voice rose slightly, his passion evident. No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. To accept anything less than full accountability here would send a dangerous message, that abuse of power can be justified, so long as it's cloaked in the guise of good intentions. Crane stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory statements. Judge Wright raised a hand. Sustained. Mr. Green, focus your remarks on the evidence. Marcus nodded, his composure unshaken. Thank you, Your Honor. Let's focus on the evidence. He turned to Peterson, who sat stiffly at the defense table. Officer Peterson's own testimony has shown inconsistencies. He claims Ms. Carter was a threat, yet there was no evidence to support that claim. He cites his training, yet his actions contradict the principles of de-escalation and fairness that every officer is sworn to uphold. Crane, visibly frustrated, leaned toward Peterson and whispered something. Peterson nodded but kept his gaze fixed on the table. Judge Wright leaned forward slightly, her tone firm as she addressed both attorneys. This courtroom is a place for facts and reasoned argument, not theatrics. I expect both sides to maintain decorum and focus on the legal issues at hand. Is that understood? Both Marcus and Crane nodded. Yes, Your Honor, they said in unison. As the session progressed, Marcus called Peterson back to the stand. The officer's discomfort was palpable as he took his seat, his posture rigid. Officer Peterson, Marcus began, you've stated that you acted in accordance with your training. Can you explain how your training justifies arresting someone without clear evidence of wrongdoing? Peterson hesitated, his eyes darting toward Crane before answering. I believed Ms. Carter's behavior was suspicious. In my experience, that was enough to warrant further investigation. But not enough to warrant an arrest, Marcus countered. Correct. Peterson's jaw tightened. I was following protocol. Protocol, Marcus repeated. Can you point to any specific part of your training manual that supports arresting someone without probable cause? Peterson shifted uncomfortably. I don't have the manual memorized. Marcus pressed on, his voice firm. Officer Peterson, isn't it true that your actions were influenced by assumptions about Ms. Carter's race and presence in that neighborhood? Objection. Crane shouted, his voice sharp, speculative and argumentative. Judge Wright's gavel struck. Sustained. Mr. Green, rephrase. Marcus nodded. Officer Peterson, can you state definitively that race played no role in your decision-making that day? Peterson hesitated for a moment too long. I don't believe it did. The silence that followed was deafening. The jury's expressions were unreadable, but their focused gazes made it clear they were absorbing every word. As the court adjourned for the day, Peterson left the stand, his confidence visibly eroded. Naomi watched him return to the defense table, her own resolve unwavering. The weight of the trial had shifted again, and the cracks in Peterson's defense were becoming impossible to ignore. Outside, the protests continued, their chants growing louder and more unified. The community's voice was rising, and the courtroom had become the stage for a broader battle for justice. The courthouse steps were alive with activity as the trial gained national attention. Protesters filled the streets, their voices echoing through the air. Signs reading "Justice for Naomi," "End Police Bias," and "Accountability Now" created a vivid tapestry of solidarity. The movement had grown beyond the local community, drawing activists, leaders, and media outlets from across the country. Naomi stood by a window inside the courthouse, watching the crowd below. The chants were loud, but there was a sense of unity in their voices that steadied her. She turned to Marcus Green, who stood beside her, his expression pensive. "This has become bigger than I ever imagined," Naomi said quietly. "That's because it's about more than just you," Marcus replied. "It's about everyone who's ever been in your shoes and hasn't had the chance to fight back. You've given them a voice." Outside, leaders from various organizations took turns addressing the crowd. Reverend Daniel Price, who had become one of the most vocal supporters of Naomi's case, stood at the center of the courthouse steps. "This trial isn't just about one officer and one woman," he declared, his voice booming over the chants. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to fester unchecked. It's about holding those in power accountable for their actions. Today, we demand justice, not just for Naomi, but for everyone who's been silenced, ignored, and mistreated." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy electric. Reverend Price stepped aside to allow other activists to speak, each sharing personal stories of injustice and calls to action. "We're here to fight for change," said Angela Ramos, a young organizer from a nearby city. "This isn't just a moment, it's a movement. And it doesn't stop when the trial ends." As the trial progressed, the protests outside the courthouse grew larger and more organized. Local businesses donated food and water to the demonstrators, and volunteers set up stations to distribute supplies. Musicians played songs of hope and resistance, adding to the uplifting atmosphere. Amid the crowd, conversations buzzed about reform, accountability, and the broader implications of Naomi's case. "I've been stopped for no reason too," said one protester to another. Watching her fight back, "It gives me hope that things can change." "This isn't just about her," another replied. "It's about all of us. We're finally being heard." News crews from major outlets lined the sidewalks, capturing the scene for viewers across the nation. One reporter stood with a microphone, addressing the camera. What began as a local trial has become a national flashpoint for discussions about police accountability and racial justice. The outcome of this case could set a powerful precedent for how incidents like this are handled in the future. Social media was equally ablaze, with hashtags like #JusticeForNaomi and #EndRacialProfiling trending worldwide. Celebrities, politicians, and public figures added their voices to the chorus, amplifying the trial's significance. While the community's voice roared outside, the courtroom maintained its air of solemnity. The jury appeared more focused than ever, their expressions serious as they listened to the arguments presented. The weight of the case wasn't lost on them. They knew the world was watching. Judge Wright addressed the court before the next witness was called. "I want to remind everyone present that this trial is not about public opinion. It is about facts, evidence, and the pursuit of justice. Let us proceed accordingly." Her words carried authority, but even she couldn't ignore the hum of energy filtering in from the protests outside. During a recess, Naomi stepped outside to address the crowd. The chants quieted as she took the microphone, her voice steady despite the emotions welling up inside her. "Thank you," she began, her words carrying across the plaza. "Thank you for standing with me, for standing with all of us. This fight is about more than just my story. It's about creating a world where no one has to endure what I did. It's about accountability, fairness, and equality." The crowd erupted into cheers, their support overwhelming. Naomi stepped back, overwhelmed by the wave of energy directed toward her. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to smile, feeling the strength of the community behind her. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Mark Peterson sat in a private room with his lawyer, David Crane. The muffled sound of protest seeped through the walls, an inescapable reminder of the growing movement against him. "This has gotten out of control," Peterson muttered, his voice strained. "They're making me out to be some kind of monster." "This trial was never just about you," Crane replied bluntly. "It's about what you represent. You need to understand that if you want any chance of salvaging this." Peterson didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the table. The weight of the case, and the protests outside, was beginning to crush him. As the day drew to a close, the divide between the courtroom and the community felt both vast and deeply interconnected. Inside, the trial moved forward with deliberation and precision. Outside, the protests grew louder, their chants echoing through the city. Naomi returned to her seat in the courtroom, her resolve stronger than ever. The fight was far from over, but the community's voice had become an undeniable force, one that would carry her through whatever lay ahead. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the trial reached its final, decisive moments. Every seat was filled, and even the standing areas were crowded with spectators, reporters, and legal observers. The air was thick with tension, each moment weighted by the implications of what was to come. This wasn't just about Naomi Wright and Mark Peterson anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger, a fight for accountability, justice, and systemic change. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture poised but her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Marcus Green shuffled his papers beside her, his focus unwavering. Across the room, Officer Mark Peterson sat slumped in his chair, his confidence shattered by the revelations of the past weeks. His lawyer, David Crane, whispered to him, but Peterson barely nodded, his mind clearly elsewhere. Judge Cassandra Wright struck her gavel, silencing the murmurs in the gallery. "Court is now in session. We will begin with closing arguments. Mr. Green, you may proceed." Marcus stood and walked to the center of the courtroom. His movements were deliberate, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "over the course of this trial, you've seen evidence, heard testimony, and witnessed the undeniable truth of what happened on that fateful day. Officer Peterson didn't just make a mistake. He abused his power. He acted with bias, treating Ms. Carter not as a citizen deserving of respect, but as a suspect defined by his assumptions. He gestured toward Naomi. Ms. Carter did nothing wrong. She complied, she cooperated, and yet she was humiliated, arrested, and treated as less than human. And this wasn't an isolated incident. The records show a pattern, a history of actions that reveal a deeply troubling mindset. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. This case isn't just about one officer or one arrest. It's about what we, as a society, are willing to tolerate. Are we willing to accept a system where power goes unchecked? Or do we demand better? Justice for Ms. Carter is justice for all of us. I urge you to consider the evidence and make the right decision. He returned to his seat, his final words hanging in the air like a challenge. David Crane rose, his expression tight. He walked to the jury, his tone measured but defensive. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this trial has been emotional, and I understand why. But we cannot let emotions cloud our judgment. Officer Peterson is a man who has dedicated his life to protecting his community. Yes, mistakes were made, but they were not made with malice or ill intent. He gestured toward Peterson. This is a man who, like all of us, is imperfect. He acted on his training and his instincts in a high-pressure situation. To punish him harshly for that would set a dangerous precedent, one that could undermine the ability of law enforcement officers to do their jobs effectively. Crane paused, scanning the jury's faces. I ask you to consider the full context, not just the headlines or the public outcry. This isn't about sending a message. It's about justice. And justice means fairness for all parties involved. He returned to his seat, his expression strained. As the closing arguments ended, Peterson sat motionless, staring down at the table in front of him. The weight of the trial had finally broken through his arrogance. For weeks, he had told himself that this would pass, that the system would protect him as it always had. But now, sitting under the gaze of the jury and the scrutiny of the public, he felt the walls closing in. His mind raced back to that day. He remembered the look on Naomi's face as he handcuffed her, the quiet dignity she maintained even as he humiliated her. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder, why did I really arrest her? The question gnawed at him, a truth he wasn't ready to face. Judge Wright addressed the jury before they retired to deliberate. Her voice was steady, but her words carried weight. You've heard the arguments from both sides. You've seen the evidence and heard the testimony. Your duty now is to decide, based on the facts, whether Officer Peterson's actions were justified or if they constituted an abuse of power. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. This decision is not just about the individuals involved. It's about the principles we hold as a society. I trust you to weigh the evidence carefully and reach a fair verdict. With that, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Hours passed as the jury deliberated. The courtroom remained packed, the tension palpable. Outside, the protests continued, their chants echoing through the walls. Naomi sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak, but her presence was steady, a quiet pillar of strength. Across the room, Peterson sat hunched over, his face pale. He glanced at the door to the jury room, his anxiety mounting with each passing minute. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent. Each juror took their seat, their expressions solemn. Judge Wright addressed them directly. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, holding a folded piece of paper. We have, Your Honor. The paper was handed to the judge, who read it silently before passing it to the clerk. The courtroom held its collective breath as the clerk read aloud. In the matter of Naomi Carter versus Officer Mark Peterson, we, the jury, find the defendant liable for misconduct and unlawful detainment. The room erupted into murmurs, and Naomi closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. Marcus placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his expression calm but victorious. Peterson's face fell, his confidence completely shattered. He sank into his chair, the reality of the verdict crashing down on him. As the courtroom emptied, Naomi stepped outside to face the crowd. The cheers that greeted her were deafening, a chorus of voices united in celebration and hope. She raised her hand in acknowledgement, her heart full but her mind already turning to the work that lay ahead. Inside, Peterson remained seated, staring blankly at the table. Crane packed up their papers silently, offering no words of comfort. Peterson knew this was more than a professional loss. It was a reckoning he hadn't anticipated. Judge Wright remained at the bench, watching the courtroom empty. She knew this verdict was a step forward, but the fight for justice was far from over. She tapped her gavel lightly, her thoughts heavy as she prepared for the next case. The trial had concluded, but its impact would ripple far beyond the courthouse walls. Naomi's victory was a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced, a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of systemic injustice. For Peterson, it was the beginning of a long, painful reckoning with the choices he had made and the consequences he had tried to avoid. I ask you to please comment on your impressions and opinions in the comments. I would feel very happy if you leave me a like.